You know, we've been putting on a lot of programs, but this one I think is really high on the priority list of importance at this time, at any time really. And so I just want to thank everyone for coming. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Grant Thornton, for bringing their thought leadership to the panel, and you know, Tony Perazzo, who's been a great partner of ours, and everyone else at Grant Thornton. Really appreciate the partnership. I know they're going to just make this a really valuable and worthwhile use of everyone's time. So we'd like to make this hour as interactive as possible and love to see everyone on video if that works for you. And with that said, I'm going to turn this over to one of our newest board members that we are very lucky to have on the NACD NorCal board, Gary Strong, to kick us off.
All right, thanks so much, Kim. And another big thanks to Grant Thornton. It's really gratifying that we have business organizations like Grant Thornton to host our series of virtual roundtables. And you know, we really look forward to a time when we can do this face-to-face, but this is the reality we're in now, so we're going with it. Also want to welcome all of you that are logged into today's conversation, which I hope will be lively, educational, and provocative, because your presence indicates that you recognize this topic as being important and timely. I'm particularly excited about our discussion today, as it is near and dear to my heart for what might be obvious reasons. I've been the only in many rooms over the course of my career, and appreciate how the experience can differ depending on the culture and the awareness of the organization. A little bit about me: after spending most of my career in public accounting and in newspaper financial executive roles, I'm currently the CEO of the California Go Country region of the American Red Cross, where I lead our efforts to prevent and alleviate human suffering in the face of emergencies for most of Northern California. As you can imagine, we've been pretty busy the last few weeks with the unprecedented wildfires that we've been dealing with. But it is truly a privilege to be part of an organization whose fundamental principles includes words like impartiality, universality, and humanity. I've seen firsthand the efforts of the Red Cross to not only diversify its leadership over the last decade, but also to create space for diverse voices to be heard. And during this current season of unrest initiated by the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and others, the Red Cross has taken an assertive approach to our response, starting with listening, followed by learning, and culminating with action. And importantly, our diversity and inclusion efforts are tied firmly to how differing experience and viewpoint can improve our performance as we execute our mission. So let me stop right here and have our panelists introduce themselves. We'll start off with Tamaya Dickerson.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'll be your host today, along with our esteemed guests. I'm Tamaya Dickerson, a partner at Grant Thornton. I'm the West Region Advisory Leader, and as a Black woman executive, as a CPA who serves boards, it's my pleasure and honor to be here to lead us through this really personal topic today. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Janice Innis-Thompson.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. My name is Janice Innis-Thompson. I am actually a member of the NACD New Jersey chapter. I currently serve, I'm actually employed by Samsung Electronics America and North America as their Chief Compliance Officer, but I also have the privilege of serving on a mutual fund board that is part of Edward Jones. It is called Bridge Builder, and we've got about $90 billion in assets under care.
Wonderful, thank you. How about Rose McKinney-James?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am calling in from Las Vegas, Nevada, and I currently serve as a member of the board of directors of MGM Resorts International, Toyota Financial Savings Bank, and I'm the board chair for the U.S. Energy Foundation. So I have been active in this space for a number of years as a director. My background is in energy, utility, clean energy in particular, and sustainability. And I have been a utility commissioner here in the state of Nevada. and also serve on the board of directors of NACD Pacific Southwest. So I'm delighted to join you and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And finally, we have Hilliard Terry. Can you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hilliard Terry, and it is very much an honor to be here with such incredible panelists amongst us here. I serve on the board of Umpqua Holdings, which is a bank up in the Pacific Northwest, and chair the audit committee, as well as sit on the Nom/Gov committee and the strategy committee. And I also sit on the board of Upstart Holdings, which is a private company that is a cloud-based artificial intelligence lending firm platform. And I also chair the audit committee. You can probably tell, given the number of audit committee chairs, I'm formerly a public company CFO and worked for NYSE listed company Textainer, and also worked in the past for Agilent Technologies, which is the original part of Hewlett Packard, and served as their VP and treasurer there. So this, for me, obviously is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and it's about time that it's actually come to the forefront, and very much looking forward to the discussion and questions.
All right, thank you so much, Hilliard. So now, Tamaya, can you kick off our conversation?
Yes, I can. Thank you again. Okay, so most thanks to NACD NorCal, Kim, Gary, Lisa, Haley, and all. We started thinking about this topic during a time that we were having protests in almost every major city, I think in every major city in America. And as we brought it together, we've come to these last couple weeks where we continue to see the impact of racial profiling and systemic racism on our community of Black Americans. And as a professional, as one who's very fortunate to have the career and financial stability that I have, in speaking with my colleagues and my friends, Rose and Janice and Hilliard, about their role as leaders, as board members, and talking about how some days it's really difficult to get up and come to work, right? As a member of the community that still has to come and get it done. I look to them and I think it must be even harder sometimes being the only one. And so today is to focus on what we can do as board members to have courageous conversations, implement metrics and enhance diversity at the committee level, and share responsibility for creating a diverse pipeline in order to ensure that we keep up momentum and that this topic and conversation continues to happen so we can grow. So with that, I want to get into the first question. Can each of you explain, and we'll probably start, Hilliard, you're closest on my left, so we'll just start and go over. Hilliard, can you help us explain with regard to perspectives on race? Have you had courageous conversations in the boardroom, and what's your experience with that with your own boards?
Yes, and I, as you know, Tania, use the word very much authentic conversations, because I think what's happened is that we've moved to a point where you can have very authentic conversations. It's one thing to look at sort of metrics and numbers and things of that sort, but to be able to have a conversation about what it's like telling my 11-year-old about certain things related to sort of the George Floyd killing is a real conversation. And being able to have that discussion with fellow board members and it be a very authentic conversation that then stems to other topics about sort of white privilege and what that means and how people react to that. Those are very real conversations that are happening. And I think it's important for those conversations to happen so that you can then move on to kind of the business of the board, and to make sure that as you start to then go back to think about metrics and what those mean, it's not just a metric, it's really sort of how do we make things sustainable given the context that, we've just had a conversation, about our topics about, it's not just about recruiting, but it's about retention. And what are those things that others have to look at around retention? Another interesting conversation I had was, in the boardroom, I have one identity, but when I walk out on the street, I'm just another Black man walking down the street. No one knows that I sit on the board of 2 different companies and chair audit committees and things of that sort. And frankly, they don't care. And so those are just the realities and sort of, experiences and things of that sort. That's not to say that everyone has to agree, but I think being able to have, again, those authentic conversations and at least be able to look through someone else's lens, or at least have an opportunity to understand someone else's lens, I think is important to be able to then move to, again, those metrics and all the other things that we sort of talk to and focus on as board members. So I'll stop there.
A real quick follow-up. Are you comfortable leading, or does your board facilitate those conversations for you to feel like you can bring your whole self and share that perspective within your boardrooms?
So the short answer is yes. But I think in a pretty fortunate situation. In both of the boards I sit on, I've recruited Black women to the boards. And so it starts with, I'm not the only one sitting in the room anymore. But the reality is we've been having those conversations, not over the past 2 months, but over the past couple of years. And so I have to be able to bring my authentic self into the room. And frankly, you're going to get more out of me if I'm my authentic self, frankly.
Okay, thank you. Janice, you're smiling the big. Go ahead.
To me, let me also say, my fellow board members also bring their authentic self into the boardroom as well.
Right.
And so that doesn't mean that we're all sort of saying the same thing. I have very conservative board members. I have folks who have, support certain folks. I won't name any names, but it's interesting to have that conversation and be able to have the conversation and also have a fun dinner.
Perfect. And for those of you that are viewing, please feel free to put your Q&A in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can as we go through the program. Janice, I was saying you were smiling the biggest, but Rose was jumping out of her seat. So I have to go to her because I feel like she's channeling her inner church woman, and then we'll come back to you.
That could be the case. Because as a follow-on to Hilliard's comment, the answer to your question is yes. We did engage in what we actually call a courageous conversation, a conversation that was to be led by our CEO. I joined as the chair of our Corporate Social Responsibility Committee, and we worked directly with one of our major affinity groups. And given what had occurred in June, we decided that beginning with our African-American cohort was probably the best approach. But this came after my decision to test just how committed I felt my board and management leadership really was to this issue, because I'd seen a statement from our CEO. I felt that the board needed to be engaged as well. I think it rose to the level of board engagement. And so I have to say reluctantly, but quite affirmatively, I felt that I needed to lean in, and I did. And so I suggested that a letter co-authored by the board and the CEO be the path for opening a conversation with our employees, with our stakeholders, to state more than a position, but a willingness to be more proactive in the space. And I was a little concerned about whether or not my fellow board members would see me in a different light, because I'm a long-term board member. I've had these colleagues for many years, and our conversations have focused on governance. But this was the first time we were speaking to what we had identified as a core value, which was equity and inclusion and diversity. To my absolute delight and surprise, it was the board chair who leaned in, who's willing to say, I think that Rose's suggestions are worthy of consideration. And so that's what resulted in the decision to move forward with these courageous conversations. We did that. We were able to achieve candor. There was an open dialogue. It was uncomfortable. For me, it was painful. There is a burden that comes with being the person who's willing to speak up and through your ethnicity and through your personal experience. But I felt that it was a necessity, and to be joined and supported by the other members of the board, to see the commitment of the CEO through this initial courageous conversation was extraordinarily uplifting. But I'm still focused on making sure that we take the information and the feedback that we got and we translate it into something that is meaningful. So I've gone from statement to action, and now I want to see some change.
Thank you, Rose. And Janice, I mean, you and Rose, like, you know, y'all get me every time. So can you take us home on this question on courageous conversations?
Certainly. So I come at it, as you know, Tamaya, from two different perspectives. And I mentioned earlier that I currently am at Samsung Electronics. And so the first part of the courageous conversation started there. I'm not a board member. I am the Chief Compliance Officer. Samsung's board is in Korea. But as you can imagine, the issues that were going on with regard to COVID, et cetera, and the impact that that's had on the Asian community, because there are many who do not distinguish between, oh, you're Korean or Chinese or Japanese. It's just, you know, you're all Asian. At least they throw it out that way. So Samsung had some sensitivity around these issues. But after George Floyd's death, we had to have a big push, and I lead the Black Employee Resource Group there. And we had set up a conversation that was just scheduled for the members of the Black Employee Resource Group that turned out to also include over 1,000 people. The conversation was set up literally overnight, and we had 1,000 people plus join the conversation, many of our executives, and it really had a very huge shift in how the executives in Samsung looked at and kind of felt this issue, because people came to the conversation authentically. They came with tears. There were people talking about the times they got pulled over by police and the fears they had. And it was one of those conversations that blew the whole organization away. And it also, I think, highlighted for this very Korean-based company that's, you know, in a very homogenous country, that these are huge issues. And so we've had some great follow-on actions from that. And to Rose's point, it wasn't just the conversation, it was also the actions that have been taken since then. I switch now to my board head, the side of my head that's on a board. And as Hilliard said, the conversations and the authenticity and the issues around race started a long time before the activities of May and June and way beyond that. So I am one of the inception members of Bridge Builder, and Edward Jones actually pulled together this mutual fund board in 2013, and we had 2 women and 4 men on the board. I was the only, of course, Black person on the board. Bridge Builder is also very large, as I told you, but sub-advised. And so we've got 33 different financial services organizations that are part of the Bridge Builder family. And whenever the sub-advisors would come in to speak to the board, starting in 2014, 2015, I would regularly say, so tell me about the diversity on your team. And, you know, the first couple of times it was absolute silence. And then we started getting a little traction, and I would look at Edward Jones and I would say, Edward Jones, you're the advisor for this fund as well. And so what's your diversity? And about 2 years into saying that over and over again, I got to see that they started hiring a lot more women on the investment team, and who are doing phenomenally well right now. But I think the culmination of this, because our board meeting did not occur until August. So we had an early May board meeting, and then the next meeting was in August. But the best part for me in this journey was after 7 years at our board meeting, which was 2 weeks ago, every person supporting the mutual fund complex came in and did a diversity presentation. Edward Jones told us exactly what they were doing. The 3 sub-advisors who presented to us told us exactly what they were doing. The 2 law firms who support the mutual fund board told us exactly what they were doing. And my fellow board members at that time really chimed in and said, okay, we just don't want to hear this. We actually want to see the action. And we recognize that when you've got $90 billion that people are running for you, you can have some influence in the space. And I am grateful that I was able to get to that board early on, feel comfortable stating my point, and seeing the results that we got in August and hopefully beyond.
We're grateful too, and thank you for sharing. I think we want to make sure that the audience feels engaged. We have some polling questions set up for you all. And so the first polling question is going to run here now. With regards to perspective on race in the boardroom, have you had a courageous conversation within your committee or with the entire board? Please respond yes or no, and I will go to NACD to help us facilitate and close the poll. Okay, and we have our results. 65% have and 35 have not. So I will take that as a success because we're over 50%. And when I was in school, that's definitely the side you wanted to be on, was over 50%. And yet I'd say that thank you for coming today. We still have further to go.
Yes, but I would say that that is a surprising number. That's a surprising outcome. And I'm not sure that had we had that poll done in May or April, it would have been the same. But it is encouraging because it means that people are listening, that people are taking the steps that are necessary. So I am encouraged through surprise.
Rose, I just want to add, I mean, the reality is I think there's been a window that's opened up. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us, not just us who are Black, but I think everyone to take advantage of that and really sort of affect change, because I think now's the time. And I agree with you. If we would have done that poll in January, I think it would have been exactly the opposite. That would be my guess.
There's an interesting question, at least something that someone's posted that said, so what is each of us doing to solidify actions that transform our culture away from white supremacy? And you know, that's a big question to ask, and a big ask, I guess, overall. I think that it's that transformation away from white supremacy will take way beyond our lifetime. At least that's the way I'm certainly viewing it at the moment. But what I think is going to be critical is the education and awareness and the actions that are taken to get more people in the room and get more people in the conversation. And that's where we're going to be able to really be able to make the change. And I think even if you can't, I have not been as fortunate as Hilliard to be able to get another person of color on my board. But I do think that, you know, it's about getting the allies and the people that are on your board to really be able to see the need for that change. And to what Hilliard just said, it's not going to be just us. Black people only represent 13% of the US population. And so we're not going to be able to do this by ourselves. We're going to need a tremendous amount of allies and support. And I think that is going to come through education and awareness.
And I'm going to go, Lisa's going to cringe, but I'm going to go a little bit away from our agenda. I'm going to take some of the polling questions because I think, thank you guys in the audience. This is amazing. Janice, to your point, one of the follow-ups is, can you please address how to have courageous conversations on this topic on a board without any people of color on the board? And let's just be clear, the supermajority of boards in America, especially public ones, have no people of color on the board. And so there is no representation who people can self-identify with, right? And say, that's my neighbor, that's my colleague. So how do our, I call them white brothers and sisters, or people who are not Black, facilitate these conversations on their board when they don't have anyone to look to carry the torch?
Well, if they begin by taking the necessary steps to do the self-education around how these issues have surfaced, and they begin to look at their organization, if they seek help and assistance from others. And let me just, as an aside, because we had this conversation, it is, I think, appropriate, depending on the nature of your relationship, to reach out to those people, within your constellation who might have some sensitivity. So if you've got friends who are Black, if you have friends who are Asian, if you have friends who are Latinx, and you want to have a conversation about what that experience is like to help educate yourself, I think that's a very important step. And then you look at it through the governance lens. How do these issues affect things like executive compensation? What committee should this be discussed in? Are you looking at your employee base? Does the employee base reflect the communities where you conduct business? And if not, why? Have you not expanded the network? And please do not tell me, because this is I do not want to hear how difficult it is. I've heard that for much of my career, and I was so gratified a week or so ago during a very candid conversation with some colleagues within the Executive Leadership Council, where one of the speakers said, it is not difficult, it is different. And that fundamentally is what it underscores why these conversations are so important.
Amen. I'm going to write that down. We're going to hashtag that today on my LinkedIn. Janice, Hilliard, Rose led us right into the question, the next question, which really matters, right? Which is, especially to the point of the Q&A chat box. I mean, the supermajority of boards don't have people of color, don't have a Black person on there. Looking at your NomGov, comp, audit, ESG committees, do they have metrics that they're accountable for ongoing diversity goals? I will start with Janice, since I started with Hilliard before.
So no, at least I'm not on the Bridge Builder board, but one of the things that we did have a discussion with some of the sub-advisors who came in a couple of weeks ago was to get those metrics. And so it was one of the sub-advisors who's based in Vermont made the argument that Rose just said, which is, it's really difficult for us in Vermont to find, people of color and all that in the financial services world. And one of my colleagues, who's a white female, said, well, the great thing about working remotely right now is that you don't have to recruit in Vermont anymore. You can go elsewhere and, find a different population, which I just thought was, was fantastic. But they did tout their ESG and what they were doing in that regard. And as we know, in financial services in particular, the the SEC and other regulators are looking at ESG and how that plays in. So we were able to, I actually said to them, well, this is a great opportunity for you to create metrics within ESG, and particularly the S of your G, to address some of these issues and come back to us next time with some metrics around it. So it does create a great opportunity and a platform to start leaning into some of those metrics in your ESG committees.
Thank you so much. Hilliard, 1 second. Can you make a note or hold your thought? I had a polling question pop up, so I'd like to get your comment after the polling question so we can just get the audience polled. Have diversity metrics been established on your boards with regards to race and diversity, racial diversity, right, specifically? Which committees have they been established in? If they have any ideas for metrics that should be implemented, please place them in the chat box, but please tell us if you have committees where metrics have been established. There is a not yet established box for those of you that may not have them. This is the opportunity to get them. We're just going to wait until we get our polling results. All right, so 60% say not yet established, which I think is probably in line with my expectations. 24% say non-gov, 10% comp, 10% ESG to Janice's point, and 2%. Uh-oh, Hilliard, is that you? Who has a line in their house still, Hilliard? And 2% on audit. So Hilliard, this is great. I'm so glad we waited for the poll results to come in because you're the audit committee chair, guys. So take us home on 2% in audit, right?
Well, look, I think every board has a nom-gov, and I think every board has a comp committee, and every board has an audit committee. And so it's going to, the responsibility of, how should I say, getting those metrics in place is going to reside in one of those committees, at least in a traditional sense. But I think you've seen sort of the establishment of ESG committees. And at Umpqua, we have an enterprise risk committee that looks at an array of things. And so I think the main thing is to make sure that you have metrics and that you're holding people accountable, and that it could sit in any committee, but make sure it does sit somewhere in the comp committee, because I think people sort of, how should I say, their behaviors are largely driven by the goals and metrics and compensation that you set. And so I will say for us, while I've been able to recruit another African-American female to the board, and we do have metrics, we look very good at the board level, but when you look at the executive management ranks, we fall short. And so it's one thing for me to say that in a board meeting and challenge our CEO, but to be honest, that needs to come from the executive management team, that they need to be saying, we need to do better. And as a board, the oversight is making sure that we set the appropriate sort of goals and things of that sort. And when it comes to things like ESG, that's becoming more and more and more critical and a bigger focus. And this topic is right smack dab in the center of that as well. So my point is, it better be in the comp committee, but I think it traditionally will fall into comp or nom and gov. And nom and gov is really more when you're looking at, frankly, the board and your recruiting and things of that sort. I'll just share a quick story. When we were recruiting for a board member, the CEO of Umpqua had some very specific skill sets and ask. And basically, He wanted a person who had both traditional and online retail experience at the executive level to sit on our board. And it just so happened I knew a young lady who was Black, who had, you know, if you said you wanted a purple bear, she was the purple bear, basically. And, you know, she's young and is adding a lot of value to the board and was exactly what he was looking for in terms of the skill set. So I too agree that even when you're looking for specific skills, there is a pipeline. You just have to know where to find people, and you got to go outside of your comfort zone sometimes to do that.
Have to be willing to ask. Look,
That too, yeah.
Metrics, data will drive so much decision making. Let me follow up on a couple of things that Hilliard said, particularly with respect to the role of the management team, because I think increasingly it is important for the CEO and his or her team to be actively engaged in these decisions in tandem with, in partnership with the board. So as I mentioned, I chair the Corporate Social Responsibility Committee for MGM Resorts, and this is where much of the ESG activity resides in our company. Beyond that, I also serve on the Compensation Committee. I have found that finding best practice or industry-related information on the metrics associated with how to stand up an executive compensation strategy that embeds ESG is a challenge, because it depends on the industry. To some degree, it depends on the culture. The chair of the committee was willing at least to entertain my request that we find some ability to create alignment between our ESG goals and our executive compensation. And I was supported in that regard by the willingness of the CEO to lean in and say that he felt that that was an appropriate strategy. Now, I really believe that some of the experience that I've had is unusual, because when I joined that board, it was already diverse. There was already one African-American woman. There was also already one Latinx male. And so I joined a board that had already focused very directly on diversity and inclusion. I began to work on the sustainability component and the climate issues that I brought to the conversation just based on my professional experience. And when I found that investors were beginning to look more directly at companies to determine how they were measuring their purpose in terms of stakeholder engagement, I really found, in my view, a sweet spot for that conversation. And I'm hoping that other boards will. But I think part of the reason that we're here today is because directors are interested, anxious, and hungry for information and guidance on the best way to actually engage. And one of the ways to do that is to engage with your fellow directors who have the experience, who can point you to a network that you might not otherwise have access to, and take full advantage of it. And I think that's what it's going to take to increase the amount of actual change that we see, and hopefully to increase the recognition that actually having diverse perspectives on a board makes a difference, makes a huge difference. There is a value proposition there. This is not a social movement. This is a way to enhance your bottom line and your business.
Hilliard, you look like you're on mute. Hilliard, you look like you're going to take us.
Well, I was gonna say amen and preach to Rose, but
Please
you know,
do.
it's interesting because I've had people say this was a political thing, then it became a social thing, but the reality is it's good for business at the end of the day, and I think we need to sort of really understand that.
But tell me give me 2 or 3 examples, one or 2 examples quickly. How is it good for business?
Well, I think, look, if you're a consumer touching business, and you don't have a board that represents the array of consumers that you're touching, how can you sort of adequately sort of think about sort of strategy and ask those kinds of questions and things of that sort? That's one that's just sort of very obvious. I think when you have people with a whole different set of experiences, you know, I've been a public company CFO. You know, I've, you know, been through a lot of different things in life, and I think the richness of that sort of, I'm a close advisor to the CEO on a lot of matters. And so those are sort of value adds that you get, not because I'm a financial expert or an audit committee chair, it's just because of my background and the diversity of my background. And those are, to me, values that you, every board member can bring to the table.
I would also add, if you don't mind me jumping in and adding another one, Tamaya, I happened to speak at a Women in Tech conference last year, and this generation of employees who are coming into your companies are not going to come to your company and are not going to give you the benefit of their expertise unless you show them that you are serious about a lot of these issues. I happen to have a 19-year-old, and I mean, she is very, very clear about the fact that there are certain places that she will work and certain places that she will not work. You see it coming out a lot in the media these days. And many of the women approached me after I gave a keynote speech at that conference and basically said, well, how do I make sure that I can still go work for XYZ company with my hair looking this way, or if I have this attitude? And so as we talked it through, many of them said, you know what, if they don't accept me, I'm just going to stand up my own company. And that's what we're seeing, a lot of entrepreneurship, because people are saying either you have that culture, because this millennial and Gen Z group, they're all about the culture. And if your culture doesn't fit them, they are not working for you.
I think it's been well documented, Janice, that we are actually seeing a departure.
Yes.
A huge percentage of Black and other minority executives have said, I'm done. I have had this conversation. I have done what I could do. I do not feel that it's resonated, and either I'm going to go start my own business, or I'm just going to find something else to do, which is unfortunate. And I'll give you an example, Tamaya. As you know, the gaming and hospitality industry is very competitive. And a few years ago, as we were looking to expand, there were only a handful of licensing opportunities that were available. One happened to be in National Harbor, which is just outside of the District of Columbia. We found that having a robust diversity, inclusion, and equity program, as well as a solid supplier diversity program, distinguished us in a way that gave us the competitive edge that allowed us to win that license. So I remember in law school, but for our willingness to lean in, and nobody's saying it was perfect, not imperfect on many levels, but it existed. And the community there recognized it, respected it. We had to go through a ballot initiative in order to get to a position where we could even vie for the license. But all of that became an opportunity and a very legitimate and I think lucrative opportunity because of the steps that we had taken to establish a very strong platform with employee engagement, management engagement, and board engagement and support.
Rose, I've been to that property. It's beautiful. And I believe it's DC that was Chocolate City.
Yes.
And I will tell you that all of my friends who are in DC frequent that property. So the community has embraced MGM in that property. I've been to that property. They make me go there.
It's a beautiful property. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So I want to get into, and we're going to poll the audience in a minute, talking about something that we talked about as we were all preparing to come here today. And it's the burden that may become heavy when you're the only one. And we had the question about what do you do, one of our audience members, what do you do when you don't have any Black board members or people of color representation and you have an all-white board, right? Or a predominantly male or all-male board, as we found in California that changed the law. And one of the things that was said in preparing was we get tired being the only one that everybody goes to. I don't want to be the only one. I'm looking at some of the quotes that I noted. And so my question is there a burden of responsibility for being the only one? I'll ask the second part or follow-up question because I think we have time. And is there an explicit or implicit pressure to check your Blackness at the door when you come into the boardroom? And Rose, I'm gonna go back to you real quick because
Why?
you look ready. You just look ready.
Look, I have been the first. I have been the only throughout much of my career, and there is both a responsibility and burden, I think, embedded in the opportunity. I think there's an obligation once you have a seat at the table to make sure that there will be opportunities for others to follow. And so navigating that becomes sometimes a little challenging. I mean, I will be, as they say, let me just get real. The feeling that you are only there because you are the diverse candidate can be a little overwhelming because it suggests that you're there for some reason other than your ability to contribute intellectually or based on your experience. And in fairness, in some instances, that is true because there is a fear. There's a fear of the unknown. And if you haven't been a part of certain circles, or if your academic credentials don't include, certain whatever, you are frequently excluded from consideration. And so that is a heavy burden to have once you are there. And the opportunity to network with others who are like-minded becomes even more critical, I think. And the willingness, again, to lean in and to be a part of a conversation and to look for allies, because there are people who don't look like you, who don't have the same experience, who are just as interested in making sure that the organizations where they engage and the businesses where they conduct business, that they reflect, again, the communities where they conduct that business. So I'm always looking for allies. And I am ever focused on this notion of the sense of belonging. I want to know that not only am I making a contribution, but I am a part of the organization. So I just noticed somebody referenced one of my favorite terms, and that is the culture. The culture of an organization, in many instances, will determine its success. And absent the willingness to embrace, engage, and include, that culture is very, very lacking. And Janice, I think you said something on a conversation that we had, because I am always blown away with your insights and your wisdom. You said something about first making an assessment, then engaging, and then figuring out the actual action steps. And that's what you have done with your board work. And I think it'd be really helpful for others to hear how you navigated that, because I was very impressed with your approach.
Yeah, so it's an interesting journey, right? Before Samsung, I was actually at TIAA, and as I was explaining to as we prepared for this panel, TIAA happens to have and had, I think, at one point a Black CEO, still there, He's one of the two that's in the Fortune 5 at the moment, and a Black board chair for for both of its boards. And I reported into both of these boards, and so and TIAA was able to actually attract a lot of good talent and a lot of very diverse talent because of this board structure and because of the feeling at the organization. And in reporting to these boards, there were clearly these Black chairs of the board were fearless in asking these questions. And I, sat in rooms where they were asking other people these questions as an employee. And so when I got on the Bridge Builder board, and part of my interview process and part of the approaching and the assessing, as you've talked about, it was really about, would I be able to bring that with me? Can I bring my whole self here, although I would be the only one? And it was a bit tricky because, of course, Edward Jones is St. Louis. It's where people go out on their front lawns and wave guns at people, as you are trying to have a peaceful march. So it is very much that culture, and it is a very white male dominated organization. But in the interview process, I was very clear about saying, is this what I want to be a part of? And I do view board and board service as what I can offer you, but then also what are you offering me? And so when I look at what you're offering me as a board, that culture becomes a very, very critical piece. And so the assessment during the interview process was very critical. And then actually gauging, once I sat on that board and I asked that first question around, what is your diversity? And there was absolute silence. But then after that, the chair of our board, we're at dinner, and then he starts explaining his own story to me. And then the conversation starts happening around the entire board table about, how they were feeling on different issues. And so that became interesting. And then that led to, immediate allies in a great space, in that space. And so it came to a point where I wasn't the only one asking these questions anymore. My fellow board members were asking the questions. And so that was very helpful in terms of the action and the pointed action that you need to have. And so I do encourage you all to the extent that, you're on board, you want to have this conversation. It's really important to, gauge the environment, but then, get the allies, as Rose has been saying over and over again. And it could be in a side conversation over dinner, over lunch. I have two of the women on the board. Once George Floyd was killed, one called me directly and said, I need to know. She said, I suffer from white privilege. I admit it. She's from Minnesota. And she says, I need to know how I should be thinking about this. Give me some thoughts based on where you sit. And to answer your question, Tamaya, is it tiring? Absolutely. I've had many, many, many conversations. But I actually view it too as a huge privilege. And to be able to respond to that. And I fully agree with what Rose said about, getting to that table and having some people look at you and thinking, oh, you're only here for this, when you can contribute others. And as I may have said to you in other conversations as well, just to round this out, but as you can tell from my funny accent, I'm actually from Jamaica. And I think the privilege of growing up, at least until I was close to 12 years old, in a predominantly Black country where a sense of inferiority was not an option, because we were the majority. I bring that to every table. I bring it to the table in Korea. I am often the only Black person at the table in Korea or at the hotel in Korea. But my whole thought is that, no, I belong here, and there's nothing you're going to say that is going to make me feel any differently about this. And it is from that perch that I am then able to say, I'm bringing my whole self. You can take it or you can leave it. So.
Amen. All right, we're going to church today, y'all. Hilliard, I'm coming out to you to round out before our last polling question for the audience. And brother, now, remind me, I hope I don't get this wrong, I believe you're from San Francisco?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I grew up down the street in Stockton. And our first conversation, we were talking about whether we feel a pressure, implicit or explicit, to check our Blackness at the door, coming from, really truly integrated, or to Janice's point, predominantly Black communities, right? And comfortable households. So what's been your experience? Tell us a little bit.
Well, look, yes, I'm from San Francisco, but my family, my grandmother and everyone, they're from the South. And so I grew up with things like you have to work twice as hard to sort of be able to get X as sort of someone who doesn't look like you. I think just in general, I run paranoid. And I say that in a professional sense because that causes me to sort of work harder and things of that sort. The reality is it's a huge responsibility, but it's a responsibility, as Rose said early on, that we've been living all of our life and professional life, and it's not going to go away. And I'm sure I will die with that responsibility. So it's just something that we live. And you know, it's interesting because after the George Floyd killing, sort of I started getting calls from folks who they needed to call someone Black and check on them. And the first couple, you know, fine. But then after the, I don't know, 20th call, it was sort of like, this could be a little exhausting. But look, I think for me, my biggest issue is more around just, again, what I started with, and that is making sure that we have an authentic conversation. And I will say to people, let's not start the conversation if you're not ready to start the conversation, because once you go down a path, you know, things can be uncomfortable and all that good stuff, but it's important to get there. So I don't like to even describe it as a burden. It is what it is. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us who have a seat at the table to make sure that there's another seat for someone else, and that we sort of champion and take advantage of, as I said, windows like this to make sure that we move things forward and not let things continue to slide backwards as they sort of had been doing. So that's all I'll say on this. It's not necessarily that you're from sort of a San Francisco or a Stockton. I think, to me, and we both know, sort of our upbringing was undeniably Black. And so that in and of itself is going to sort of cause you to bring your authentic and unapologetic self to the table.
It's true. So let's get into the final polling question for our audience. As an independent director, I quote, bring my whole self to the boardroom and check my personal history at the door. How much of the time? So we have 1 to 5, 1 being never and 5 being all of the time. So let me say it again. As an independent director, I bring my whole self to the boardroom and check my personality at the door. What percentage of the time? With 1 being never, I don't have to check my personal history. I can always show up as myself. Or 5 being, I always have to check my personal self and I never get to show up as myself. Rose is anxiously waiting to see what the answer is.
I have found the polling questions to be really, really interesting. I think it's an important feature with this platform. So.
And Rose, I really, interesting.
All right, you write that down. Okay, so we're going to get to the answer. 42% of the time, people feel like they have to check their whole self at the door. They never have to check their whole self 15% of the time, and 9% of the time, or all of the time, they have to check their whole self. So, you know, that's a pretty interesting bell curve that we have there. But still, I think that speaks to just maybe the pressures of coming in and being in a high profile position where people feel like they can't be authentic. And that we all deal with it, and maybe the board is unique. Go ahead, Hilliard.
I sort of would challenge people because I think you're there for a reason. And the reason has to do with you, your experiences, the things we talked about earlier. And I understand sort of why people might answer things a certain way, but I would challenge people that I think you will increase the value of what you contribute to the extent that you are sort of your whole self. And I think that's better for everyone. I think that'll potentially make you a more influential board member, a whole bunch of things. So again, I just challenge people on that one to really be yourself.
Go ahead, Rose.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, no. I understand, however, why people would say that. And I think it's interesting as a woman and a Black woman kind of coming to the table and not wanting to put your whole self there, especially when a lot of the times you're the only woman and then the only Black person in the room. And it's about trying to assimilate, and in order to be effective, there is a feel at times that you have to buy in fully into the culture. And there's a fear, there's absolute fear. And I've experienced it many times. And it's interesting because the moment you decide that you just don't want to do that anymore, and you decide to just bring your whole self, it is a huge relief. And you find that you're not going to get pushback. But I think the fear is that we have been raised with, no, you don't bring your whole self. You know, as a woman in the workplace in particular, you're going to bring that part of you that's highly buttoned up and professional. And, you know, so I think you get to a point in your career, and I think I got to that point, frankly, for me at TIAA, where I had a lot of very strong women supporters, and I was able to say, I'm going to dress however I want to dress. You know, I am going to come to the meeting and offer the perspective that I think I was hired to offer, not because I'm a female or whatever, but the perspective that I was hired to offer. But it took courage. And so I get the fact that there is that fear and that courage that's needed.
And Janice, I agree with you. And I should have highlighted the fact of, I think I've been on one board for 10 years. And so I would say me bringing my authentic self is just, that's what you get now. Versus when I was sort of green and sort of trying to sort of, you know, find my way in a lot of different ways of just getting up to speed on being a new board member and a new company and all that good stuff. So I hear you. I agree.
Let me just add that I think it is human nature to come to any environment with a certain amount of filters. You sort of filter how you interact depending on the circumstance. And in the boardroom, one of the things that I think we all want to avoid is this notion of groupthink. So in order for you to make a contribution, you have to bring your authentic self, and you have to be willing to weigh in and to speak up, because a director who does not do so is not, one, adding value, and two, doing their job. And so being prepared, especially under these circumstances, because most of us are so focused on things like liquidity and survival right now, that this additional conversation, which should be an ongoing conversation, can be perceived as taking away from the core responsibilities of the board. Let us get to that after we have determined how, you know, what we're going to look like post-COVID. Well, post-COVID, if you don't deal with these issues now, because we've been dealing with this May, June, July, August, it is clearly going to be a part of our national conversation and the national sort of fabric of the dialogue that we need to undertake. And so most people, I think, people who know me appreciate the fact that I have an awesome sense of humor, but you don't always see that in the boardroom. You might see it at the board dinner a little bit, but principally I come ready to work because that's the job. I take my committee assignments very seriously. As the chair of a committee, I have extra responsibility and I have additional interactions with the management team. And so I guess it depends, but I really have an aversion to groupthink. And I think it's so easy to fall into that when you're filtering everything and you're not willing to say, hey, I really don't think that's workable. So.
There's a couple things. I got to leave. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I keep watching the chat box, and so there's a great question there. I don't know if you were going to get to it, Tamaya, so let me let you go first.
No, you go. You go.
The one about the pipeline, and so yes, there are so many platforms out there for folks who are wanting to get on boards and are looking for ways to develop themselves to do that. There are many organizations, including work that NACD is doing, but there are other organizations, Women Corporate Directors, there is Women in the Boardroom, there are, I know several of the big firms like the KPMGs and the Deloitte, they also have platforms that they are developing folks to be able to get them into rooms that they wouldn't typically be in, and into searches that you're not going to get through the big board search firms. I think also the most critical piece of it is networking. That's going to be the bottom line, because a lot of these board roles are never advertised. And so it's about who you know and who they can get you in touch with. And a perfect example, one of my fellow board members on Bridge Builder was asking me recently if I was interested in getting on a non-for-profit board that she's on, that involves a lot of reading. It's a publishing company. And I said, you know what? And she says, we're looking for a person of color. And of course she's coming to me. So I said, I'm not available for that one, but my niece, who is just perfect for that. And that's how a lot of these positions get filled. So I think literally go, scroll through LinkedIn and just ask for conversations with people. I've had people message me on LinkedIn and say, can I chat with you about X, Y, or Z? And I always respond. Rose and I belong to an organization called ELC, and part of the mission of that organization is to make sure that you are, helping others and responding to others and pulling other people up. And so if you message me on LinkedIn and I can help you in any way, I'm going to reach back out. So I do encourage folks to do that. So.
Well, I think, go ahead.
Can I just jump in on that? I think, a lot of these readiness programs are important, but at the end of the day, it gets down to the networking and who you know. The best recruiter for a board is an existing board member. And so I think it's incumbent upon us who are sitting on boards to make sure that we're on the NomGov, or not just on, chair the NomGov committee, or chair the audit committee, and sort of create the influence so that when there are opportunities, your voice is a strong voice when it comes to recruiting new board members and things of that sort. And look, when you get on your first board, it's your first board. And so someone needs to sort of give the opportunity and what have you. And as I said, when the CEO of Umpqua was looking for someone with very specific qualifications, I found just that person, and she's Black. And she, like I said, she's been awesome. So that's where I really think it's incumbent upon us to do our job as board members to recruit and find those diverse candidates.
Thank you so much. So we're going to end on time. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes. Y'all have had such good conversation. I didn't get to my final question, but we're going to go into it a little bit. So I'll ask you now to think about your recommendation for the audience when we wrap up in a few minutes. But before that, we've skirted around a topic that came up during our preparation that I noted, and it's the idea of a zero-sum game in the musical chairs of filling board seats. And what that means is that I understand that some of you, I can't remember who, thankfully, has had conversations about, is it reverse discrimination if we're specifically seating women or if we're specifically seating people of color? Does that, is that taking away a seat from a, qualified white guy? And are these candidates qualified? The idea of, qualification or it being their first as a kind of risk that's coming on. So this will be our last one. I'm going to hold you all to about 60, maybe a little more seconds. We'll start with Janice, who's smiling the biggest, and go from there, and then we'll wrap.
Right, and this came up because one of my colleagues called me up about a board she's on where she was very much pushing, diversity for that board, and was told the board has, I think it is 7 men and 2 women, and was told that, the one guy they wanted to put back on, that it would be reverse discrimination if they didn't put him back on the board. So she called me to ask me, what suggestions would I make when that argument is thrown out at you? The only thing I could really think about at the moment to tell her was to say, okay, look, if there are 7 of you and 2 of us, and the male-female population in the United States is 51% women and 49% men, how is this a reverse discrimination? You guys have certainly gotten the majority here in a huge way, but also to really get some statistics and details about that organization and why it would be important. So it's been said over and over again here that the diversity of a board adds value, and I think that gets missing when people bring up qualifications and reverse discrimination, etc. And so that's another piece, I think, adding in the value piece of it, but also looking at the statistical component were the 2 examples I gave her.
All right, so I'm gonna only take one of you. Rose, it looks like you're ready. So Hilliard, we'll get your final thoughts at the end.
No, I was just going to say that what is really interesting around that question is not only just looking at the statistics, because to Janice's point, women represent better than 50% of the population. And so a willingness to think about who is represented on the board and how it reflects outward is important. We talk a lot about culture. We also need to talk about brand and reputation, because exposing yourself to the first call that says your board does not reflect X, Y, and Z ought to be something that every director considers. And while it is a huge challenge to deal with succession planning and the need to create a robust way for refreshment, I guess is the phrase. I think some organizations ought to begin to think about what it's going to look like on the front page when they begin to talk about reverse discrimination when it comes to providing minority participation on their boards.
Well, thank you so much. So Hilliard, please take us home. Suggestions on how to continue to move the needle, metrics that matter. What would you say is the 1 or 2 takeaways from today?
There are not just 1 or 2 takeaways, but I think I'm going to sort of really share 2 thoughts. And there are many, many more takeaways. But number 1, for those of you who are sitting on boards, do your job. And your job is to make sure that you increase shareholder value by making sure that there's diverse folks on your board so that you can sort of have the best ideas, the best outcomes, and just maximize value. End of story. And that means we're all charged with sort of doing this. And it's not just me because I'm Black. I think it's everyone who is charged with doing this. So that's for people who are sitting on boards. For those who are seeking board opportunities and you're Black or Latinx, the window is wide open. And make sure that you are reaching out to folks like myself, Janice, and Rose. And I trust and believe if you reach out to me, we will talk. And I will do everything I can to sort of help you, get on a board or whatever you're trying to do. To me, and I met through a private equity firm, and we've been sort of connected at the hip ever since then. And so, my last point is just to those who are seeking more positions, take advantage of the now, because the window is open. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure how long the window will stay open, but it's open now, and we should do everything we can to take advantage of that.
Well, thank you. With that, those final words, we are wrapped. I want to say thank you to NACD NorCal for allowing me the honor to host our conversation today. To our esteemed guests, thank you for sharing your respective experiences. And to our audience, shout out for the white guys out there. I've had white mentors and white male promoters my entire career. So y'all keep it up. Keep pulling us up with you. I thank you. I thank you for coming, and let's do better.